Welcome back. My name is Darren Thomas and I am the Director of Educational Research Techniques. In this video, we're going to look at how you write the last section of a social science quantitative research paper. It's often called the discussion and the conclusion section. So let's go ahead and see what we can learn. So we're going to divide this up into three parts. We're going to talk about the overall structure of the entire paper, just kind of as a review. Then we're going to talk about the individual sections of the actual discussion and conclusions. And then we're going to, of course, also have some examples of each of these parts of the discussion section. So let's go ahead and take a look at the overall structure. So if you've made it this far, you've probably been working on this paper for months, if not even over a year or maybe even several years. This is the final section. This is the climax of your research experience for whatever your project was based on. So you began by working diligently on these first three sections here. This is often called the proposal section if you are doing a thesis or a dissertation, or if you have to submit it to an IRB or something on your campus, you might also have to submit these first three chapters. So your introduction, where you lay out your study, your purpose, your objectives, the review of literature, where you kind of share what other people have done in relation to your topic, your methodology, how you're going to answer your questions about your problem. This is all the things you've been working on. This probably takes the most time. In other words, if you have a project that goes over the course of a year, this might take about 8 months of it. Like seriously, it's really the majority of what you do. By the time you get to your results section, this is faster because you've already laid out your recipe in the chapters 1 through 3. It lays out everything that you want to do. And of course, the methodology is critical in order to develop your results. But calculating the standard deviations and the means and doing the t-test and ANOVA and the regression, that doesn't take a lot of time. And so by the time you're sharing your results, by the time you're done with your first three sections of your paper, it's pretty much that is the work. That is the hard part. And so now finally, we get to this last part right here, the discussion and conclusions, and that is built on everything you've done up until this point. It's built on everything coming from down here. And so there isn't really one way to do this. And another thing I have to mention is that you have a little bit more liberty in terms of what you can say in your discussion and conclusion compared to the other sections. There's a lot of restrictions, and you will learn this if you're new to this, to research. There's a lot of restrictions in terms of what you can say going through your first three chapters. It's very, very thoroughly checked, and it has to be approved by someone else, especially if you're a student. When you get to the conclusion section, this is where you can unleash your critical thinking, but with the assumption that it is grounded in your results, what you learned. In other words, you can't wander off. And I know this all sounds fuzzy, and the best way to learn how to do this is working with people and experience. But your conclusions can be strong. You can begin to share your opinion a little bit more strongly here, as long as it's grounded in what you learned from your results. You can't pull stuff, from random places or just start, jumping on your soapbox and preaching. Your conclusions, your interpretations, and your explanations of why your data is like this has to be based on the data. It has to be grounded in your results. So there are 4 parts in general to a discussion and conclusion section. And again, look, there's many different ways to do this. This is what I found that works over the years as I've done this. But of course, no two people are going to agree on how to approach this. So you're going to have a discussion section. Okay, then you're going to have some recommendations. You might have your limitations here, and you might have conclusions. Now, limitations, sometimes this is not in the chapter 5. It might be in your introduction section. It really depends on who you're writing for and what is the purpose of writing. And this is important for any style of writing. You must keep in mind the expectations of your audience. And so I cannot sit here and say this is the only way to do it. But what I will say is that in general, people are going to agree on these 4 parts, but they might disagree on defining them, and they might disagree on where to place them in your writing. That's the best way I can guide you in this situation. So let's start with the actual discussion of the discussion and conclusion section. So you start by sharing your major findings. That is the first thing you do. And I mean, the order depends. Like sometimes people put what they think is their most important finding first and then go decline in terms of importance. Other people put the least important. It's up to you. But the main thing you're trying to do here is you're trying to compare and contrast what you found with other publications. So this is where you bring in, I learned this is similar to this person, this is different from this person. And of course you have to explain why. And this is where you're allowed to speculate a little bit. Why your results are different, why your results are the same. Again, sometimes you do this, sometimes you don't. And of course you want to pull studies, not just from your review of literature, which is critical, but you also want to compare and contrast to other studies. All right. And so how many findings or how many findings should you put? Well, remember, it depends on the audience. If I'm writing for a journal and I have a word cap of say 5,000 words, 7,000 words, I might have 3 or 4. That's because of the word cap. Now, if you're writing a thesis or dissertation where you have way more words that you can use, you have more real estate and you can put more thought into it, you might do 6, 7, 10, whatever. It doesn't matter. Again, it depends on who your advisor is and the expectations of the institution. But I want to go now and share with you an example. So I start here by saying there are several conclusions. I always do this that can be made from the results of this study. So first, what did I learn? The participants disagree with behaviors associated with academic dishonesty. All right. So this is what I learned. They disagreed. In other words, they don't agree with that these behaviors are okay. Now, this could be due to, so now I try to explain it to the context. So I'm saying, well, maybe this is because of the context. All right. Okay. The data was collected from a Christian university. So, Christians often have different morals about, stealing and lying and things like that. They're not as, they don't agree with those type of behavior as much as perhaps maybe other people do. In this context, an emphasis is placed on morals. Okay. So I'm trying to explain why what I learned here disagrees with what others found, and values that support honesty and discourage deceitful and other morally questionable behaviors. And then, of course, I put a reference for this explanation here. So this is where I'm pulling from other studies. And then I continue. However, most, if not all, universities are united in condemning academic dishonesty. So I say yes. There's a moral emphasis in Christian schools, but all schools condemn academic dishonesty. You're not going to go to a secular school and they're going to be okay with, plagiarizing, copying, cheating, whatever. All right. So what I put here is what this means is that the religious setting of the school may not have mattered. Again, I'm speculating here. Maybe this doesn't make a difference. Okay. That's what's happening here. And so you can see how I'm sharing my thoughts based on two things, based on my results, which I showed you that already, and also in comparison to other literature. So I'm going to put lit on here. And it's called a discussion. It's a conversation. In other words, I say this, but Abu Safia, agrees or disagrees with me. Thomas agrees or disagrees with me. Nagy and John agree and disagree with me. I'm grounding my opinion in my results and the literature and the works of others. This is a very careful balancing act because I have my results, I have my literature, and then I have my interpretation or my opinion. And it takes a long time to find a balance between all these. What happens a lot of times is people have a lot of opinion and it's not really grounded on results or literature. That gets you in trouble. People have results, but they don't really have an opinion, or they don't really have any other literature. People have lots of literature, but they don't have results or opinion. So you have to find a way to balance these three things inside a paragraph. And it's more of an art form than a science. But what I think other teachers and other researchers will agree with is that these three things work together in your discussion section. The balancing act between them is going to depend on whoever you're working with. And also, like I've already said many times, keeping in mind your audience. Moving on. Now, one more thing. And so what I want to also conclude is that I would do this process, 3 times in, an academic article, because I'm starting to run up on my word limit now. So I would have 3 paragraphs like this. Finding number 1, that's why I have a first here. In the next paragraph, I would have a second. And in my last paragraph, I might have a third. I would do this normally about 3 times. Again, that's not an absolute rule, but I found that this works for me. So I have 3 paragraphs that are using this pattern of mixing results, literature, and my opinion together to try to provide insight and, analysis of what I've learned. Now, moving on here, we're going to the recommendations. There's often 2 types of recommendations, and this is one in which you try to find ways that you can apply what you've learned. And another type of recommendation is like, here's how we can continue to study this phenomenon going forward. All right. And so what happens is that when people see these things, they learn how they might want to apply your knowledge that you've given to the world. Excuse me. And they also get insights into how they can study this. So a lot of times with students, you will go to the further study section of a paper to get insights into what kind of dissertation or what kind of thesis you might want to do for yourself. So let's look at examples here. So the results of this study lead to the following recommendations. All right, that's the key word here. First, schools should support fairness or procedural justice in the classroom through clear policies and consistent enforcement of those policies. So have your rules and enforce them all the time. Don't change them on the situation or how sad the story is, etc. When students are aware of the expectations and that they will be held to them, this can help in developing a climate of fairness. And so then I have my literature here. So you have your recommendation, which basically that's what you think. You're not going to find that on Google. Sorry. You have your recommendation. Plus, you got to have some sort of literature to support it. You can't say, do this because I'm the expert, And again, remember that your recommendations are going to be based. So the base of the recommendation is from your results. In other words, I found out that this was important. Procedural justice matters. How do you make this abstract ideal of procedural justice practical? Clear policies, consistent enforcement. These 2 things right here is how you are going to make this fair. That's what we're talking about right here. That's how you make procedural justice come alive in a practical real world sense. And this is one example of a recommendation. So normally I would do about 2 of these. Again, you could do more, you could do less. But again, like I already said, I don't want to repeat myself too much. I'm beginning to crash into my word limit often by chapter 5. Now, this right here is an example of further studies. Let's take a look at this. A second study should explore religion in the context of academic dishonesty. Now, if you've been paying attention for the past 10 minutes, you know that one of my findings when I was talking about my results is that, hey, maybe religion makes a difference in terms of academic dishonesty behaviors. And so now I'm making a recommendation to study these concepts. All right. This study was conducted, I'm reading again, at a Christian institution, but comparing the results here to a secular institution can help develop a conclusion as to whether religion affects moral actions regarding academic dishonesty. So, in other words, what I'm suggesting for the reader is repeat this study and compare the results you find in a Christian university, which supposedly have a greater commitment to, moral values, and compare that or contrast that with what you will find at a secular university where they have an emphasis on, of course, avoiding academic dishonesty, but there's often disagreements about other types of morals in a secular context. That is what I'm suggesting right here. Now, the final section. One thing I need to mention also, is how many recommendations for further study do I do? I do 2. That's why you can clearly see the word second here. There was a first. And again, is that enough? Keep in mind your audience. Keep in mind the requirements of the journal you want to publish in. Keep in mind your word limit. All these things are things you have to balance. There's a balancing act here. You can't please every reader. You can't please every peer reviewer. You just want to please the majority. Okay. So if 3 people look at your paper, you're trying to get at least 2 of them to support it. That's really how it works out. It's more of a numbers game than making a perfect paper. Excellent writers get rejected all the time. Supreme researchers get rejected all the time. Now, let's wrap this up. A last part of the discussion and conclusion section, we're getting towards the end here, is limitations. And this is where you share some of the weaknesses of your research. Every paper, from Nobel Prize winners down to, science fair projects in high school, have weaknesses. In other words, There's a weakness when you pick a particular type of research design. There are weaknesses when you pick a certain type of data analysis. There are weaknesses in terms of variables you have to leave out because the study would get too big, etc. And so you need to share with the reader some of these problems so that they're aware of them, because they might want to repeat your study by dealing with one of these weaknesses. Okay, so they say, okay, well, he did this. This was a strength, but he mentioned that there's a problem here. I'm going to address that problem, remove something else that this person did, and we have a new insight. That's really how it works. Now, let's take a look at this. The sample size for this study was adequate but small. So I had a small sample size, 112. That's not good enough for most quantitative scholars, given the number of variables involved. In addition, here's another problem. The cross-sectional nature of the research design means that longitudinal conclusions are not possible. So I'm not making conclusions based on something that happened over time. It was a snapshot. There is also an assumption of truthfulness. So when the students or the respondents filled out the survey, I have to assume they're telling the truth. They can lie. They can put whatever, they can check whatever boxes they want, and that weakens the results and the conclusions that I can make. All right. In addition, I'm dealing with academic dishonesty. And so, people don't want to admit that they copy or cheat or that they think that's okay. Especially when you think about the context of the university, where it was a Christian university, people are not going to say there, oh yeah, it's okay to copy, it's okay to cheat, because there's a moral expectation that, hey, we don't do that here because of the morals that are being conveyed there. All right. Of course, and a more famous one is, my study was focused on correlations, but that does not imply causation. So just because these variables are related to each other doesn't mean one is causing the other. To do that, you have to do more of an experiment. And so these are just some of the weaknesses. And there's nothing radical here. There's nothing innovative here. These are common challenges when you're doing research. And so what can happen is that someone can read this and they can find ways to deal with this. Like, okay, well, maybe I can if I want to do further studies, I can do a longitudinal study, and I can track how students think about academic dishonesty over time. And I can deal with this cross-sectional weakness. Or maybe I can find a way to make sure they're telling the truth. Maybe I can do interviews and I can get to know the students and develop a relationship with them. And then they'll share with me what they really think about these topics. So go qualitative rather than quantitative. Also, dealing with this topic, again, the same approach might be appropriate. Develop, instead of anonymous surveys, getting to know them so that they openly share. Now, for the correlation thing, I might want to find a way to do an experiment. However I would approach that. So these are just the challenges in the study that readers need to be aware of. All right. And so the conclusion, which is the final piece, that's often a summary of the paper where you're just kind of repeating yourself. There's nothing new here at all normally. And this is different from the discussion in that you're just summarizing what the paper's been about and what you've learned, and you're not really trying to pull in new literature. And so here's my conclusion here. Again, this is different from the discussion section where you kind of laying out, the literature, your opinion, and your findings, mixing those together to try to produce thoughts. Here, you're just trying to summarize it. So this study aimed, I'm reading right now, to explore the relationship between academic dishonesty, e-learning, and procedural justice. The results indicated that the relationship among these variables were non-existent or weak. That's what I learned. Differences were found in terms of class level and academic dishonesty, blah, blah, blah. So I'm just rehashing the results here, nothing innovative. And that's essentially what we have for a paper. So let me see if I can kind of wrap this up and conclude things. When you are writing the discussion and conclusion section of your paper, there are several parts. You're going to have a discussion where you combine your results, your literature, and a little bit of your opinion together into several paragraphs. That's what you do there. In the recommendation section part 2, if you will, you are going to be talking about how people can use your results and how people can extend this conversation by studying different topics that you might want to recommend. And again, excuse me, this must be grounded in literature again. It must be grounded in your results. After that, you have to share limitations. some of the weaknesses of your paper, give or take. And these are often common, like everybody knows these are problems, but they need to make sure you know their problems, basically. And then lastly, you're going to have your conclusion section where you just kind of summarize it. Now, how long this is going to be altogether, it really depends on the context. I couldn't give you a word count, but I told you how many paragraphs I write for each section and how I go about addressing that. You must keep in mind, who are you writing for? That is the number one way to being successful, is not to try to find a magic bullet that works every single time, but finding the magic bullet that works for that situation. That is really the key to being successful as a researcher, keeping in mind who you're writing for and writing things in a style that is acceptable to that audience. So, my name is Darren Thomas. I am the Director of Educational Research Techniques. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and you take care.